Hello, I'm Dominic Longo from Flourishing Gays, convening this HIV and COVID heroes and shadows conversation with my friends in the San Francisco Bay Area, Gregg Cassin and Bill Glenn. This is the second conversation that we're having on this topic of this intersection. These two HIV veterans really reflecting and sharing memories from their own experience as relevant in a new way for us all today as we navigate COVID and the kind of new realities that we're in. In the week since we had our last conversation, I'm gonna ask you guys to talk a little bit about how our first conversation stirred up stuff for you. And how it settled with you. I know that you had conversations with different people, but I also want to note that there's a number of articles in the mainstream press that have come out in just the last couple of days on exactly this intersection. This one from the Wall Street Journal, also today in the New York Times, and then in the Gay and Lesbian Review, a couple of articles, one from yesterday and one from a week ago. So lots of people besides us are thinking about this intersection. Again, for our viewers who might be joining for the first time, I'd love to hear as you talk about what this has stirred up for you. Just say something again about your own relationship to HIV in a brief way. Gregg, would you like to start us off today?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Bill, being with us again, and Dominic for hosting the conversation. I'm incredibly grateful to be having the conversation, and I feel like I'm not the voice for people, but I feel like it's a conversation that's happening. So I feel like I wish that all these folks that I know were also right here, like joining in, because it feels so rich and so important, because going through a pandemic that is so different, but there are similarities, it has inspired so many conversations, and it's really brought up so many feelings for people. So I just want to say thank you, and I don't necessarily compare the epidemics or the pandemics. I more am very present to the memories and then feelings that come up in the way that I want to honor and remember people. And so just a brief introduction of myself. I moved to San Francisco in 1980. I was from Long Island. I moved to San Francisco to come out of the closet. I succeeded, and it was right at the time of the epidemic starting, and I knew it would touch my life, and I was probably positive by about 1985, and in the late 80s, started doing more organized work. My work became community building and bringing together communities of people that were facing the epidemic, both caregivers and people that were HIV positive. I started facilitating groups called the Healing Circle and doing retreats and stuff. And it was about bringing us together. It was about trying to stay well. It was all the different experiences, because it was just that incredible time of people, some people being very sick very quickly, and then some people remaining well. And I've done throughout these years, this kind of work has been the work that's been the most powerful to me, and the great honor has been bringing together groups of people. That has been what I've done. And
so almost, what, 35 years?
Yeah, since, yeah, that 89. So whatever, is that 31, 35?
Yeah.
And
wow.
yeah.
So what has it stirred up for you, Greg? Just starting with our conversation last week, what's happened as this settled for you in the last days?
Well, it's interesting. I had a conversation because we did a group. I work now at Shanti, which is a legacy organization in the epidemic that had a heroic response in the early days, and it's my first time working, like really working with an organization, and I'm running this program called Honoring Our Experience, brings together long-term survivors. So we did a writing workshop with another long-term survivor, Hank Trout, a beautiful writer from ANU magazine. And all of a sudden I say off the record, and I started going off, and I was like, I find myself feeling very possessive and protective about that our epidemic is ours and profoundly different. And it just was interesting to me. And I felt like I was hearing how some of my Jewish friends, when people would loosely parallel the Holocaust with something, and they'd say, please this is ours, this stands on its own, like please don't make parallels. And I found myself feeling really possessive around how unique the epidemic was because of what was so unique to such a specific community in the early days. And then it recognizing that, oh, it's affecting all these other people, the straight community, Black community, people using injection drugs, like, but there was a very possessive, like mine, like, and I think I feel that way because they're very specific. That's why oh gosh, I wanted to hear Bill talk.
Yeah.
I feel very possessive around this, and very like, this is our way to honor our people.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the articles I didn't show, it was in the Harvard Business Review, actually a couple of weeks ago, with a guy named Scott Baranato, a person who really, I think, disseminated those stages of grief, and how those stages are so applying to all of us right now. Denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and then acceptance. And those are the 5 that we kind of hear about a lot. The 6th that he wrote a later book on is meaning. And what I hear from you as you're still holding your grief from the HIV/AIDS epidemic, all of those are somehow still operative, but the meaning making and the meaning that you hold with that is sacred. I bring that up in part because the context for this conversation is indeed contributing to meaning making that we're all trying to do with the grief of giving up our normal lives and giving up the normalcy that we had. The work I do at Flourishing Gays is about creating context in which people can grow as human beings and as leaders. And right now, this is that context. It is for the 3 of us and those who watch this through flourishinggays.com or the Flourishing Gays Facebook page, or the ways that we share it. But yeah, thank you for just adverting to your that possessive feeling that you're having. Bill, I know your relationship to HIV is different from Greg's, and yet interrelated. Just remind us a bit about that, and if you would, tell us what this last week has stirred up for you through this conversation.
Thank you, Dominic. I also want to acknowledge Greg's metaphor of possession. It touches me deeply, actually. I would say, as I did last week, the AIDS epidemic changed my life in all parts of my life. But it was the work I did in a concentrated way for 15 years, and then as a psychotherapist in the gay community, I began seeing clients with HIV in 1984, and I had clients with HIV in my practice when I retired in 2019. Early in the epidemic, I went on the board of the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, which was a very small organization. I was on that board for many years and ended up chairing that board for several years, and we became the largest AIDS provider in California, and after Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York, the second largest service provider and policy institute in the epidemic. And it really grew me up and taught me how to be a leader. When I left that work, I became the executive director of an agency in the Tenderloin, which is San Francisco's soft underbelly. And I served people with HIV disease who were also mentally ill and substance abusers and neo-homeless. And I worked at that agency for 7 years as the executive. That was kind of my work in the epidemic. And what happened to me since the last time the three of us spoke, and I want to acknowledge my relationship with Greg goes back 40 years. When he was a very young man, when he came to California, I think I was probably the first person he met, certainly the first gay man he met. I was pretty young myself, but not quite as young as Greg. So our histories are intertwined intimately because we are dear friends as well as being, in different ways, long-term survivors. I had a dream. I found the conversation last week very stirring in ways that I did not anticipate. And I had a dream 2 nights ago. I woke up at 4 a.m. with the dream present to me as if I were in it. And I'll give you a very brief precis of that dream. I went back to Continuum. That's the name of the agency where I served for many years in the Tenderloin. And I came back into the agency, and there was a nurse there who I had employed as one of the nurses. We were a medical facility, we were a food facility, we were a community, we were many things. But she said there was someone who wanted to see me who was also an employee when I worked there in another room. So I went in that other room, and there was a young man there, younger than I am. And he looked very familiar to me, and he started telling me about his work. And then he started to weep, and he came into my arms, and I put my arms around him, and he put his arms around me. And we sobbed. There was nothing in our conversation that I would say occasioned the sobbing, but we sobbed for a long time. We parted, and I went back and thanked the nurse for her work, for welcoming me back. And she said she was invited me back because she wanted me to raise some money again for Continuum, which is a lot of my work in the epidemic, was raising money. I woke up with a start, and the dream was a source of great solace for me. And it became clear to me, I do a lot of dream analysis as a therapist, that the young man I was holding and sobbing with was my younger self. The thing the young man told me as I was leaving him was, "You've done enough." When I left my active work in the epidemic after 15 years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that if we get to the shadow point today, I felt I shouldn't leave, I couldn't leave, that I hadn't done enough yet. I'd done a lot. Thousands of people had done a lot. But there was never enough. You could never do enough in this epidemic, because the epidemic, from the community that I came from and loved, was decimated physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, economically. There are parallels to COVID-19, and there are, as Greg alluded to, profound differences between these two experiences, but they're life-changing experiences.
Thank you. There's something of healing in that dream.
Very.
And I wonder what healing there might be in this experience of a kind of new trauma that society's going for, or going through rather. I don't know, reactivating trauma, but also perhaps moments like you're revisiting that other epidemic and that dream.
And my younger self.
And your younger self, yeah.
If I can just say, it's really interesting in comparing the two, that in some ways, our heroes of the epidemic remained invisible almost for decades. And they were so specific in very specific communities around the country and then around the world, that like now, like for example, the nurses that started the AIDS ward, the first AIDS ward in the country. And that could sound like that we're putting them aside, but instead when they did that, they were bringing them together to give them the dignity and the care that they felt like people with AIDS should be afforded. And they were doing a job that people were running from and complaining about, like, we don't want to be put at risk by caring for people with AIDS. So it's so powerful that these people now are in a documentary and we're thanking them and acknowledging them 30 something years later. And it's something we talked about in the other conversation, of how it's this time now of acknowledging what we've walked through. And it's really, really powerful that with this epidemic right now, like, it's so many people are on the front lines in such dangerous situations that it's for us, it's unparalleled. It's just like that the everyday man and woman is making a decision as to whether or not they can go and do their job. And sometimes it almost feels choiceless, that it's expected or it's their duty. How many people have said it's their duty? And it's almost impossible to wrap my mind around how challenging that is. And like every nurse and doctor and person working on the front lines that we know.
Yeah, and that's exactly why hero is one of the themes of such interest today in this conversation. Moments of heroic or even saintly behavior are just available somehow in these kinds of crises, in the kinds of in the face of infectious disease, in face of human suffering. You know, the work I do with Flourishing Gays, one of the frames that we use is hero's journey, as a way to look at the archetype of growing and changing and becoming ourselves more fully. You know, bring together groups of LGBTQ men to support each other on that and to let themselves unfold into themselves more fully. Well, I want to hear more about your experiences of moments when in your own acting, or perhaps in someone else, you witness what you would call a sort of heroic or saintly disclosure, and especially, you know, something that maybe you didn't think that you were capable of doing, but that came out of you. Or again, perhaps someone else that just surprised you entirely by showing up, as a hero in the moment.
Let me speak to this, first of all, by saying everyone who stayed in San Francisco and worked in the epidemic was heroic. And that is not an overstatement or a metaphor. The conditions were such in 1984, 5, 6. The people fled the city. We knew who the AIDS docs were because only a handful of docs would work with people with AIDS. The ward Greg described was, everyone knew this ward at San Francisco General Hospital because it's the only place people with AIDS could go. People lost their jobs in droves. They lost their income. They lost their sense of self, their bodies. So everyone was heroic. And I have thought about this question. You prepped us on this question, actually, and I've thought about it the last few days. And my gratitude for my work is large. And I did some things in the epidemic. But I thought the most heroic thing I did, in 1984, 5, 6, we had no idea how AIDS was transmitted. They didn't know if it was transmitted through tears, through spit, through saliva, through body sweat. And so there were recommendations to have no contact with people with HIV, with AIDS. And I remember being so struck. I had come out of the closet in 1979 here in San Francisco. I was old, I was 29, and I was so grateful to be with gay men, finally, who were out living their lives. And the epitome of that for me was kissing another man, to see your friend at Cafe Flore, to see Greg at the cafe and kiss him. And then the recommendation was no kissing. And I thought, wow. And I remember making a decision with my friend Randy, who had Kaposi's and his body had lesions all over it. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be here if I can't kiss Randy hello. I don't want to be here, not here in San Francisco, here on this planet. This was the epitome for me of the affection gay men have for each other, is to, in violation of all the norms of the culture, to kiss each other hello, this simple, simple act. And I remember that when I saw Randy after this conversation myself, I gave him a lingering kiss. And to me, it was the most heroic thing I did, was to kiss my friend.
Wow.
There's so many, like, it's really interesting. There are just so many moments that I'm sure, and people that I'm sure each one of us are thinking of. I'm going to tell the simplest one. Oh my God, I have to say, I am such a fan of these conversations. They just mean everything to me, because I feel like we're like honoring everyone.
Yes.
I'm just thinking of so many of my friends, and like their moments of like, where did that courage come from? My friend Philip that I walked down the street, and his face was covered with purple lesions, and we were going out to dinner, and walking down the street, and I felt like, as we were walking down Market Street, we were heading down towards, I can't remember which restaurant it was. It's down Market Street, and I remember like the sidewalks almost parting with seeing somebody like with such deep purple, and his whole nose was disfigured, and just being like, I felt like in my heart, I felt like I was accompanying Gandhi and holding his robes to keep him from touching the ground. And then you'd see people who were like terrified, and there were people that revered those who were courageous enough. Like I felt like there were some of us that revered those people, were terrified of those people. And we got to the restaurant, and I thought, like, let me position this. and I'm going to position that we're in the corner and that he's facing the back corner of the restaurant.
Mm.
And he got to the table first, and he took the chair that was dead center, that would face the entire room. And I just remember like being like so like in awe, you know, when so many of us thinking of like that we had a pimple on our cheek and we're like, oh, I won't be going out for 2 days, you know. And that was one of the moments. And I just want to say a brief one. The other one, which was deeply, deeply important to me, was I had gone home to see my nephew, and we're sitting at the kitchen table, and I was sitting with my sister-in-law and my nephew Andrew, and he was still a little baby, and I just moved on to using a bottle and being able to drink from a cup, and we're sitting at the kitchen table, and Andrew was drinking out of a cup, and my sister-in-law said, "It's really, really delicious, this juice. Taste it." And I just like froze, and we just locked eyes, and she said, "Greg, taste it." And I took the cup and took a drink, and she took it out of my hands immediately and handed it back to Andrew. And I just felt like that was her choice to say, like, don't you think twice about being here. Oh, I just love that moment. It was just a great moment for me of that. It wasn't just my people back in San Francisco that were going to be accepting. That was 100 years ago. That was, my God, Andrew's, I think, 32 years old. It was 100 years ago.
Both of the stories that both of you said there speak to this stigma.
Mm-hmm.
Stigma of being unclean. You know, one of the convictions underlying really flourishing gays generally, and these conversations in particular, is that LGBTQ people hold special gifts for society and wisdom. And you guys are holders of wisdom that I and I think others are hungry for in this moment. What I know is that gay men actually are used to negotiating the balance between health risks and our needs for intimacy and connection. And what the stories that you just told epitomize that. Choosing connection, human connection, choosing intimacy and love, tenderness, over against potential risk or body fear, or whether you know, in the early days, you didn't know how does this mysterious disease propagate, but you made choices sometimes to be loving, to be connected in the face of those risks, just like our doctors and nurses today are making choices. My friend Alex, an anesthesiologist, was in one of our community sessions that I hosted this week for gay men to support each other in the midst of this. And he's intubating people all day long. It's like one of the most dangerous things you can do with COVID patients, because they're aerosolizing everything from their lungs. And it's like the kiss that you're giving to your friends. It's like your sister, was it your sister, Greg?
Sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law offering you her child's cup. It's in a way a similar level of expression of love in the face of risk. And the stigmas are also the places perhaps where some of the shadow side shows up. I don't mean to direct your anything about your stories here, but the other side that I asked you to kind of think about a little bit, and I want to ask you about now, is sort of these cautionary tales from, again, yourself, your own behavior, or someone else, when you or they acted in a way that was like a narrow interest, the lower self kind of taking over in a way that you would have never imagined. Would you be willing to share some of those stories, again, for us, in a spirit of vulnerability and generosity to those to me, to others who are listening, to learn from those experiences as we face those temptations today?
I'll tell two stories, one tiny and one more complex. And the first one, I hearken back to my friend Randy, who was my first close friend to be diagnosed. And when he came and told me he had this disease, and the metaphor of stigma is correct. In fact, the language we really used back in the day was lepers. People with, the man that Greg accompanied to the restaurant was regarded as a leper. And that by being near this man, you could get this disease. It was a horrible time. But early on, Randy told me he had HIV. It wasn't called that then, it was called various things. And my first impulse, and I have shame around this 37 years later, my first impulse, and it was immediate, was like, I hope he dies. I don't know where it came from. But it occasioned that I asked my question about who is this man to me? And it required that I came to understand that this is a man I loved, and that I would kiss this man. That would be the remedy for my wishing he would die, was to kiss him with the dignity that a kiss implies and offers to the beloved. And that is with me today as if it happened today. Deep into my work with AIDS at Continuum, I had run this agency for 7 years, and through the last 3 years, I built a building. I represented the agency, but I was the general manager. We bought a piece of property and we got a pro bono architectural firm to design this state-of-the-art medical clinic. And we built it in the neighborhood that had had no new buildings in decades. And we raised a lot of money, and it was hard work. And we ran the agency at the same time, taking care of these very compromised human beings. And to honor the people who donated to this capital campaign, we had a dinner at a law school nearby. And I didn't invite the staff because we couldn't afford to pay the staff for this meal. Monday, I got back to the office and a staff member came in who I had had a very charmed relationship with. She was deeply offended that she had not been invited to this dinner. And I snapped. I was sitting at my desk like I am now, but my desk was piled with shit. And I took my arm and I threw everything off my desk. And I looked at her and I said, I can't do enough. I can't do enough. I can't keep everyone, I can't do enough. I just kept saying, I can't do enough. Half crying, half that macabre laugh of a person who's at their end. She left my office, as I would have too had I been her. I felt so ashamed and I felt broken. I didn't know I had the capacity to behave like that. But it was a wake-up call for me. I went on a retreat shortly thereafter, as I do each year, at a monastery, and spent several days in silence. And it became very clear that I don't like this term, but that I was burned out. And I had to stop this. And I spent another year doing this work, but the work had gotten to me, it had eaten part of me away. And I didn't know that because I am competent and I'm strong and I am forthright and I can raise a shitload of money. It didn't matter. It had eaten me away, as it had differently eaten away the flesh of so many men that I loved.
Thank you for sharing that, Bill. And the dream that you shared earlier only becomes more meaningful when it was that young man who cleared off his desk in a rage. That's the guy who needed the solace. That's the one who needed the hug. And that's who you were holding when you woke up at early in the morning, whatever, in a fright the other night.
Thank you for observing that.
Thank you for being so.
I think it's interesting, Bill, right? That there isn't, like, we don't have real clear terminology or definition or understanding of a very healthy way to transition when one recognizes like that they're done. And it feels like, well, maybe it's because it does feel like it's a state of emergency and that everybody must stay on deck. They're just needed. You know, I mean, it's kind of like what they're doing now with nurses and doctors. Everyone come back. If you're retired, come back. If you're in nursing school, come back, come now. I think of my former partner, David, who was a social worker, was a case manager with people with AIDS for years. And he moved here and he continued doing that work when we met, and we moved him and Brianna, our daughter, here to San Francisco. And he was heroic in the work that he was doing. And he had a client who they found out was positive because she was pregnant. And so then they tested them, and then they tested the whole family. So the baby, the mom, and the husband were all positive. And the husband wound up dying in an accident, falling off of a roof, which I think, oddly enough, we had someone that had the same story last week. And that he had, and so the mom and daughter were left alone. And so David was just everything to this family, and to the point where we spent a holiday in UCSF with this mom and the baby, because the baby was always in and out of the hospital and spending weeks sometimes there. And when she died, David had that moment of that it was time. Like, he could not take it anymore. And I remember going to and thinking like, oh, he can't stop. He's needed. Like, and it was going to one of these workshops that like I felt like defined my early years of every kind of, how do I stay strong? So it was John Kabat-Zinn. And so I used to go to Jack Kornfield, Ram Dass, Stephen and Andrea Levine, and John Kabat-Zinn. And so I was sitting in the hallway with John Kabat-Zinn's wife, and I was like trying to figure out, how do I get him to stay? And she was like, oh, you don't. He's done his time. He's done his job. And I was just like, I thank God it was a big shot that was saying that, because if anyone else had said that, I was like, you don't understand. He has to stay, and he has to go through this difficult time. And it was so helpful to have it like, oh, he needs to go. He's done his work and he needs to go. And that's as important a reckoning, and as important awareness, and as important self-awareness or transformation is to know when, like that and now. So it just mirrors what felt like your moment, Bill, of that we're just recognizing this was my time, and now it's a new time. Do you have anything to say to that? Like, isn't it interesting that there isn't I can't think of a positive or an understanding. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have a term for when people recognize that. Like, because you said it's burnt out, and like it makes it seem like, oh, this is something that shouldn't have happened. This is a negative thing. I've fallen apart, or I've been like, or I just couldn't do it anymore. Instead of it being like, oh, this is sacred to recognize. This is I've done,
Like
and
a
then
tour of service.
something else. Yes, I think it's interesting. Work on that, Dominic. Would you please get that term?
I am very interested, Greg, my friend, in you talking about an experience you had in which you reached your own limits, or you were aware of your own. You are a very talented guy, and I know, having had lunch with you a million times, that half of Market Street comes up to you to pay their respects to you, and I mean that literally.
Mm.
But I'm interested in when you were stretched, or when your shadow side became something difficult for you or a surprise to you. Because you do not have a strong shadow. You are a person with a lot of light.
So I'll say one that was like, it really can't, it was something so obvious, and yet I was surprised. So we were doing a 10-week workshop. I just wanted to make gatherings. So, and I loved the idea of a committed group of people continuing spending time together. And it was called, oh my God, it was called A Path to Oneness. And we committed to each other as a group. There were 12 participants, and we met every week. Oh my God, I just remembered his name. I've thought of this guy a million times and never remembered his name over the last 20 years, and his name was Jerry. And so anyway, we were meeting, it was probably the middle of that 8 times. So to give a preface to this, my work of bringing people together at that time was so insanely complicated, because I was a person with HIV who was deeply, deeply terrified of everything that was in store for me and everything that my future held and wasn't going to hold. And so it was so complicated, and I was trying to stay alive and trying to stay well. And that was one of the things of the group, that there was, in my own way, huge denial and fear. So we had this 10-week group, and in the middle of one of the weeks, Jerry passed away. So it was surprising. And we came together in our group. It was on Tuesday nights. We're sitting in a circle, and there's this one New Yorker that was there, and he wouldn't sit on the little, like we're meditating, we're holy, we're spiritual, little like Buddhist pillows. He would bring a beach chair as if he's going to goddamn Jones Beach, and he'd sit on that beach chair, and he's always kind of sitting like this. And every time he came to the group, I felt like he was saying, I hate him. So I was just so self-conscious around him. Jerry dies, and we have a group that I completely just start the group as if Jerry is there, and I just go on with the group. And about 45 minutes in, I just hear this bark from the corner of the room. Is anyone going to acknowledge that Jerry died this week?
Mm.
And I remember thinking,
Mm.
like in my heart, I was just devastated and humiliated. And I thought, please shut up.
Mm.
I
Mm.
and there was the early days where I did so much work with guys like Stephen Levine and Ram Dass and this new agey kind of stuff, because I felt like Beth was this horrible enemy. And there were many friends that I was not at the bedside of. And it could be said that I was too busy. There were too many, because I was leading a group that was bringing, you know, sometimes over 100 folks together. But I know I was really, really afraid that it was really hard to walk some of those people all the way to the end.
Greg, you said a second ago that back then you really thought of death as the big enemy. What do you know now about death?
Oh, I think it's such a real question I have that I've asked over the years is, can you lose wisdom? Like, because I feel like when there was a time I became the person I wanted to be. I became that person. I became more courageous. I became a person who I felt proud of. So I think, I mean, I asked that question because I'm like, I feel like there was a time when in my life where I felt like I had a foot in the world of those who passed and in this life. And I felt so comfortable having a foot in both. Like there was a time where I just felt so comfortable. And now I feel a little bit more attached to being alive. And it is so much because of having my daughter and having the grandbabies. Like we have 2 granddaughters, and she's pregnant with another kid, and it's just joy that I never thought I'd have in my life. I never ever thought I'd have this kind of joy, and it's all because of David and his generosity and us coming together in '95. So I feel a little bit less like, oh, you know, both ways are good. You know, like that was a great thing to feel when everyone was dropping around you. That you better get there, otherwise you're gonna be a fucking mess. So I'm glad I got there, but I don't feel exactly there now. So I don't understand people who are these courageous ones who have families and will go in with a mask to work all day long. I know a woman, Liz, who's a respiratory therapist at Laguna Honda. How in God's name does she have the courage to do it? I don't know if I could do any of that.
Can I say something to you?
Please.
I value your story about not knowing how to be with your friends who were dying so much. That story was everywhere. we couldn't acknowledge that story. It was too shameful, too embarrassing, too human. And to hear you share that today is a gift to me. And I will observe this about you. I've known you since you were 20 years old. You have a crude wisdom that matures and deepens. And the man who's in this conversation today, loving his daughter and his grandchildren, is a larger, more periscopacious man than the 20-year-old, the 30-year-old, the 40-year-old. It's accreted, and it has to change. I'm very grateful for who you are and where you are now. But that story, I'm in your debt that you shared that story. That you shared you, brother.
I think so. That was, I don't know if we talked about this last time. I don't know what we've talked about out of the interview and in the interview, but there is that. It's worth bringing up only because so many people that are drawn to this conversation to listen to this interview will be familiar with this experience of, there is that everyone remembers something that they didn't do.
Yeah.
Someone that they didn't call, someone that they didn't visit. And there is some point where, for me, like being at this place where it was enough, like when I got to that place where I heard that, like in my heart, in my being, like, oh, yeah, there's all those things, there's all those missteps, all those mistakes, but you did really try hard.
We titled this conversation today, HIV and COVID, Heroes and Shadows. And as we wind it up, and thanks to both of you being so vulnerable with your own moments of being at the end of your rope and being, it seems like a more apt title for this conversation is something like Heroes and Their Shadows. And you have, in your vulnerability, exemplified how even in your heroic contributions and giving of yourselves, and because you are such community builders and survivors and veterans, that you're the right people to be having this conversation here. But you have exemplified how you too have your shadow, and it gives me permission to not measure up sometimes, and it gives me permission to have my own growing edge. It gives all of us permission to muddle through the best we can, and sometimes, yeah, we don't show up the way we want to. So thank you for being so open with all that you are and all that you have been. And thank you for this.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure. And thank you, my dear friend, Gregg Cassin.
So thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Bill. And it is just so great to recognize that we're honoring everyone as we have these conversations, that there's so many people who, some that we can't even remember the names or the faces of, that deeply touched us. And now I want to say, like, my own thing is, it's hard for me to really believe, like, that this is happening again for so many people, that this kind of fear and this kind of challenge and all of these losses and all this suffering. So I guess I meant it to be saying, in reflecting back to those we've lost, but it also is this wake up for me to remember, like, this is happening again. Like, I haven't experienced big loss right now. I haven't experienced big loss through COVID, but I know people on the front lines, and my fear is that I will be, but that's not important. Like, so many people are dealing with this deep loss, and that is really powerful to remember, like, that we all can be of service to that.
Yes. And
Can I
as
add
we,
a line to that?
sure.
A coda, in addition to the loss and the suffering, there is grace occurring right now. Just as in the HIV epidemic, grace was everywhere. We had to have eyes to see it and the willingness to receive it. But there is so much grace in this epidemic right now. It's evident online every day. It's evident in our neighborhoods. It's evident in the way New Yorkers every evening open their windows and acclaim the beauty of these healthcare workers. This changes us in many ways, but it doesn't all change us for the bad. It changes us for the deepening of our humanity too.
As you say that, both of you, I think of, I mean, today is Thursday, April 9th. We're in Passover. I'm going to a Seder tonight. It's Holy Thursday. We're in Holy Week. And trying to make sense of and in both of those faith traditions, the Jewish and the Christian, as they make sense of these holidays, there's tremendous destruction and betrayal and murder at the heart of those stories. And of course, we remember them and these two traditions because of the grace, because of the working of God in the midst of that, and because of the goodness that comes up from those shadows. Thank you for this conversation, and I'm Dominic Longo with Flourishing Gays. Look forward to the next time with you guys.
Thank you.